I never even thought to have the discussion with you, but would you mind sharing with us how this wound up becoming something that was a passion for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I worked for our agency, started on patrol, eventually worked my way into the crime scene unit. In the crime scene unit, I was exposed to many different things, a lot of traumatic incidents. I've seen children that were still locked in child's safety seats, involved in car accidents, completely thrown out of their vehicles, just laying on the side of the road. I picked people off of railroad tracks and had to fingerprint them before. And you don't realize how that stuff starts to affect you. And I think it really hit home with me when I realized that the call for service one day was coming from my own home. And I lost my 3-year-old son in a choking accident at our home. And the feeling that I had after that, and not only me, but my wife, for the first several years after that, we walked around in a complete daze, a complete realm of darkness and everything else.
Mhm.
Um, until we were approached about the sudden and traumatic loss seminars and critical incident seminars, and we're invited to attend one of them. So that's where all of my interest got piqued.
Okay. Um, well, I think, and I hope that I'm not touching on something a little too sensitive here. But just to kind of demonstrate how this really affects us. You and I talked about it previously before we started recording. I remember a conversation you and I had. Do you remember the conversation that I'm referring to?
I have to refresh that one because we've had so many outstanding
Okay.
conversations.
Um, we were in particular discussing how your mindset was coping with the loss that you were experiencing. You remember it now?
I do. I do.
Okay. So just so that those of us or those that are listening to the podcast or watching it, um, Pete and I were having a closed door conversation one day. This was after he come back from leave, still obviously grieving from his loss, his family still grieving from the loss, and he wound up having a conversation with me, and he told me, and now mind you, this is not too long after he moved from the crime scene division over to a more command staff position. And he wound up telling me that he knew that he should be feeling a different way, that he sees the way the loss is affecting his wife and that it's affecting his family. But he didn't he didn't feel exactly like they did. That he was obviously grieving, he was obviously devastated by what he and his family were going through. And correct me if I'm wrong, Pete, but you were kind of confused on why your emotions were a little bit different than the rest of your family and especially your wife. Is that correct?
You're 100% correct with that. I felt that in a way that my wife was alone in her grieving process, but I was also alone in mine.
Mhm.
Um, and I think some of that was what you touched on already with that we've got this stigma attached to us that we are supposed to be the strong ones. We're the deputies, we're the police. We put on that badge every day and we go out there and save the world, but until you realize that you can't save that world every day, especially when it hits your own house, that's when it starts to hit you. But I went my way with my grieving and I let my wife go the other way with the grieving.
Mhm.
And that just led to years of destruction for our marriage.
Yeah, and I think it's also important to point out the fact that one of the things that we talked about during that conversation was the fact that with you working crime scene, with everything you were exposed to, whether whether it was a child's death, whether it was a murder, whether it was a suicide, whether it was a fatal crash, um, everything that you experienced, going back to that statistic we talked about, those 188 critical incidents, everything that you experience conditions your mind to process this information vastly different than someone who was never exposed to it or has not been exposed to it, especially to the extent at the time that you were.
Yeah.
And I think that that correlation, goes back to all of us. You've heard it as much as I have. Those of us that work in public safety often enough come off as crass. We come off as having a morbid sense of humor and things of that nature. But it's because we are exposed to these elements, these things that we experience so much and on such a high rate, that in my studying of it, I found that that is our way of coping with it.
That's
That
exactly.
that being crass and being morbid and making the jokes to ourselves winds up being a coping mechanism for us more than anything else. And to the general population that sees that and doesn't understand the public safety subculture within our general culture, it comes off vastly different to them. However, to us, it's completely normal. It's completely normal for us to be on one of these scenes and see everyone around us crying, falling apart, and everything. And while we're talking with them and dealing with them, we're compassionate. We're showing empathy for what they're experiencing. But then we're back by ourselves. We're talking about something else, and it's because our brain compartmentalizes that information differently to help protect us, to help allow us to be able to do the job at the level that we do it. Is that something that you would agree with?